Greetings, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. I would like to start this video off with a very special thank you to the coffee crew. This will become part of the introduction from now on. Tina S., Heather P., Anonymous, Lalinia, Felicia Scott, Inner Scare, Glenda Villamar, and Tina Mead. Thank you all so much for buying me a coffee. I appreciate your extra support. If you like what you are hearing, down below in the description box, you can buy me a coffee. I would greatly appreciate it, as it helps me out and the channel. Thank you all so much. It has been brought to my attention that I need to mention the ad placement in my videos, which will now become part of the intro. I will then do the intro, there will be an ad, I'll read the first story, there'll be an ad, and then no more ads throughout the rest of the video. Just in case it startles you, everyone will know. Just a reminder for those who forgot, next Wednesday is when I have my surgery, so I will be recovering for possibly 2 to 4 weeks, just depending. Just a friendly reminder. With all that out of the way now, it is time to go back to ashes. For when we arise from the ashes, we are a bigger, brighter, stronger, and happier person in the morning. Now, sit back, relax, or tuck in and get warm, and let's get you that dose of vocal melatonin that you crave so much with these true, creepy backwoods stories. This is so weird, I don't even know where to begin. So, I've been house sitting for some friends in the rural PNW. They live up in the hills on a long, twisting road, and the house itself is at the end of a long gravel driveway. The house also sits up against a big evergreen forest. I should also mention that at one point, the driveway branches off and goes into the woods. I have no idea why. I've explored in there before, and there's nothing. The road is too overgrown for a vehicle to get through. Or so I thought. Recently, it dumped snow up here, and I've kind of been trapped, as my gutless sedan doesn't have four-wheel drive, and the driveway is covered in over a foot of snow. And of course, the road hasn't been plowed. Anyway, a couple nights ago, I was sitting up awake reading. I haven't been sleeping well because I got COVID, and the coughing keeps me up at night. At about 11:30 p.m., I saw headlights outside the window. I could hardly believe it. First, it was late at night. Second, there's been so much snow that most cars couldn't even make it up here. And third, my friends are out of state, and no one else would be coming up here, certainly not at night. I peeked out the window and watched as the headlights, instead of turning the bend in the driveway toward the house, kept going into the woods. What? I was curious, but I'm also a coward, so I didn't do anything as ridiculous as follow the car into the forest in the middle of the night. But I couldn't let it go. So, in the morning, I grabbed my boots and parka and stupidly left the house to investigate. This next part, I genuinely can't explain. There was one set of tire tracks in the snow, heading down the rough road into the woods. I followed them about half a mile into the forest, and then they suddenly stopped. There was a large fallen tree blocking the road, and no vehicle in sight. The tire tracks just ended, and No footprints in the snow either. That's it. I wish I had an explanation, or a better ending than me running like hell out of the woods. But I don't. I'll be glad when my friends get back, because it's seriously creepy as F up here. This next story is broken into 3 parts, and all 3 parts are rather long. Here we go. Okay, so first off, these stories are 100% true. Most were told by family and friends through the years, along with some of my own encounters in the rural mountains and ridgelines of my county, of course. As with all creepy stories, to give you a good scare, take them with a grain of salt, however. I must still say that these stories are as real as me sitting here writing this story. I hope you all find these as interesting as I do. A little background. I have grown up in eastern Kentucky for several years since the age of 1. My family, both sides, have grown up in the rural Appalachians their whole lives as well, but, as with modern times, moved to the small town nestled here in a valley situated in between rolling hills and deep ridge lines. Where the following stories take place is a rural area nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains. It's got a name, and it's considered a county. However, the area where my dad's family grew up in, within this area, and where these stories come from, is more like a collection of deep ridges and mountain folks than anything else, just to clear up any confusion that this is an actual town. During the early days of the settlers, these mountains were home to the Cherokee Indians. Many cemeteries in this area has actually around 30 to 40 graves of Native Americans buried there marked with stones and rocks, rather than a more traditional Indian burial routine in the 1800s. George Washington's aide-de-camp, Colonel Grayson, was bestowed upon him a 70,000-acre piece of land, which now is where my town is located at today. Story number 1. In the 1970s or 80s, my mom and her aunt, along with their small cousins, were driving in an empty road just outside of town when they created the top of a hill where an abandoned farmhouse stood. They stopped their car in its tracks when they saw a massive hovering saucer-shaped craft hovering over the house. Frightened, my mother and her aunt booked it out of there at a high rate of speed. Scared, they continued down the mountain back to town quickly. However, when they looked in the rearview mirror, they saw the craft coming after them at a high rate of speed, tailing the car. And keeping up with it, they attempted multiple times to evade the craft, but to no avail. It chased them for over a mile back to town, until finally, just at the ridge of the county road that leads back into town, it finally disappeared. My mother has told this story at least 100 times to family and friends, most of which believe her, as they too have seen strange lights in the sky in and around various areas of the community. Though some don't. She drew me a picture of the spacecraft a few years ago, which I still have. It's gray and almost metallic looking, by the way. She drew it, and it has red lights on all edges of the bottom of the craft, along with a few green lights on the sides of it. Story number 2. When my mother was a child, old enough to know when something is going on, was at a home with her parents and siblings one night. A man whom her mother and family already knew and were acquainted with barged into the house, scared out of his wits. He lived in a cabin deep within the woods, some miles away, during his stay. There he reported poltergeist activity, orbs, and paranormal activity within the property and house itself. He would go on to tell my grandmother that, reportedly, he was tormented all night by a demon who threw pots and pans, glasses, and even furniture at him. This went on for almost the entire night. It would throw them completely out of the cabinets, almost hitting him with it. It also reportedly started knocking and tapping on the sides of the house and thumping the walls and ceiling. Finally, he mustered up the nerves to utter the Lord's Prayer and attempt to rebuke it in the name of Jesus Christ. This seemed to piss it off even more and causing it to become even more aggressive, and now would try to kill him with more heavier objects. He ran from the house and spent around 7 to 8 hours walking through the woods and rural country roads back to my grandmother's house. While on his way to the house, he reported that he could hear footsteps trailing him in the woods and next to the road, but he couldn't see anything. It continued this for several hours until he finally reached their house. Story number 3. In the 90s in town sat a white brick house at the top of a small hill. A man and his wife lived there for several years. The man was in his 40s or 50s, and the woman somewhere around the same age, I believe. Anyways, one day, while my mother was working at a local gas station, where the woman also coincidentally worked at, the man had called her, saying that something was wrong with the gas in the house, and he was going to go look at it to see if he could fix it. The gas was located in the basement. He went downstairs and laid on his back and crawled up under the thing to see what had happened. He lit a match, and immediately the house exploded, sending rubble everywhere and a massive fire hall and smoke that could be seen throughout town. The man's wife, who saw the explosion from the gas station, ran home to discover the house was completely gone and nothing was left but its foundations. The man's body, as one might expect in a situation like this, was blown into pieces, with body parts even littering some neighboring houses. Since then, it has become a local legend that the man's spirit haunts the house that was built on the land where the original one stood. The show Ghost Hunters, or maybe another ghost hunting TV series, actually filmed an episode here because of the experiences by the home's inhabitants. Everything from pots and pans rattling and stuff being thrown around to actual manifestations inside the residence. Here is part 2 of my local folklore, myths, and legends series from right here in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains of eastern Kentucky. Story number 1. Where my dad's family lives is up in a series of ridges and hollers that, for the sake of this entry, I will call Webb, Kentucky. My dad's entire lineage has lived there since the 1800s. I have looked into our family tree, and it is chocked full of history. From an old one-armed Irishman who built the two-story log cabin where my father's family grew up in, and where his grandparents, my great-grandparent, lived at their entire lives, to Native American heritage. Where the following story takes place is at my uncle's house, which is the two-story log cabin built by said Irishman. My uncle died in 2010 of a massive heart attack on his porch at the home. And most of the time, it's since sat empty except for my aunt, my grandma's sister, staying there during the spring and summer. The house itself has had a history of paranormal activity, from disembodied footsteps coming up the upstairs rooms to voices and apparitions. My whole life, my dad and his sisters and brothers had always sweared that the house was haunted by the spirits of my great-grandparent, the one-armed man who built the property, and possibly even my late uncle who died there. But that isn't the only thing that has happened there. In the late 90s or early 2000s, somewhere around that time, my uncle, who loved spending time out in the woods day and night, coon hunting with his pack of hunting dogs, was out one night on one of his nightly hunts. According to my aunt, who heard this story from my uncle, who retold it to my grandparents later on, he was in the woods when something chased him out with great success. He said he could hear bipedal walking tailing him in the woods. His coonhounds, who were akin to predators, seemed frightened and wouldn't chase after whatever it was. He fled through the woods as he heard whatever it was chasing him from behind. He barely made it home by the skin of his teeth, as whatever it was chased him all the way back to the property. He retold the story to my family a few weeks later while visiting. Story number 2. My uncle, Dad's eldest brother, had moved back to the mountains after some years away in the nearby city. After remarrying, the family kept up with him from time to time, but he said on his own and doing quite well. However, unfortunately, in mid to late 2016, he was diagnosed with incurable lung cancer and was given only a few short months to a year to live. Seeing as how he didn't want to die in the city, he decided to move back to the hills of home. He spent a little while trying to find a suitable house or trailer to move his family back into. But after a while, he finally found one nestled on a very steep hill with a gravel road leading up the hill to the house. It sat surrounded by dense, dark woods in a backyard that was walled off by a massive rock fence with even more woods surrounding it. The house was what I would describe as a log cabin type build, with a light brown wood covering the outside and tin or shingled roof. It even had a small hot tub off the side of the small porch, but it had not been used in quite some time. However, that wasn't the strangest part of the property. In the front yard, in a medium-sized garden that the previous owners had made, sat a grave. Yes, a real grave. It was of a stillborn infant baby, a fetus whom had died in the 1970s or 80s prior and had been buried there ever since. I found that extremely odd and unnerving, but the inside didn't fare much better either. Whoever had lived there previously must have left in a hurry, as they left all of their belongings behind. Dishes were left on the kitchen table, a TV, bed frames were taped together in the bedrooms with only the bedrolls themselves being taken. Little girls' clothes and a Minnie Mouse TV stuffed into the closet of a back bedroom. And in the backyard was the strangest sight of all. A massive burn pile made up of furniture and pieces of objects and personal effects, all scorched and burned black, with a giant circle of black surrounding the pile, signified by a black outline in the dirt. The whole house had a very eerie and creepy vibe to it, like something was wrong there. Very wrong. My father, as a promise to his dying brother, started work on the house immediately, arranging for satellite TV to be hooked up in the living room, which is where my uncle and his family were forced to sleep at while work was underway elsewhere in the house. However, soon, this happy abode turned into a living hell. Sleeping in the living room, you would hear feet walking across the wooden floors. Doors would close and open by themselves, and shadows were even seen. My uncle started seeing a small boy and an older man in overalls and straw hats, who, after a while there, would torment him, even up until his dying day. His wife, who thought he was going crazy, never knew anything odd was happening. That was, until while at the kitchen sink, he saw a boy in overalls running past the kitchen window. Going outside, nothing was there. His daughter always soon started experiencing the oddness of the property, as she told her mother that she had been playing with a boy in her room just a short time ago. When going to see what was going on, nothing was there. My uncle was continuously tormented by these spirits, even locking my family, who went to visit him in the back bedroom out of fear that they would hurt them. Eventually, however, they were found to finally flee the home, having been run out by all of the aggressive activity inside the home. My uncle did eventually pass way in 2017, but the entire time he was there at the home, he was tormented by the restless spirits of the man and boy. After his death, the family pastor and another preacher went to the property and blessed it, and attempted to banish the dark entities haunting the log cabin. They threw holy water on the walls and front and back doors, and ordered the spirits out in the name of Jesus Christ. After that, no one knows for sure if the property ever had any more odd activity again. Story number 3. My father would stay the nights at my grandmother's when she was still alive. She died in 2018. Most of the time, he would stay with her because she was afraid of the nighttime, as she had some form of sundowners and would see and hear things at night. So, he stayed to calm some of her nerves at night. This particular night, her sister was visiting for the week, and he decided to go up and hang out with them for a while, and stayed the night. Well, At about midnight or sometime after that, he was awoken by the sound of the garbage being gone through, and a loud thump as whatever it was had knocked the lid off the trash can, causing a loud sound that had awoken my aunt and my grandmother, as they got my dad up to investigate whatever the disturbance was out back. Grabbing my grandfather's old shotgun and a flashlight, he opened up the back door and walked out back to investigate. Having seen the trash can lid and trash can been gone through, he walked further out through the back area to see if anything was out there. And that's when he saw it walking back up the hill and back into the woods was a very large and very tall creature in white, with red eyes reflecting the light from the flashlight bouncing off of it. The creature watched him the entire time as it walked back up into the woods as it vanished. My dad walked back inside, white from what he had just seen, pale as a ghost. My aunt tried to ask what had happened, and that is when he told her and called my mom on the house phone. Relaying the encounter, my mother had my stepbrother try to find an odd encounters from the area, and he found one. A man had reported being followed in the woods while he was walking down that same stretch of road one day. He never saw anything, but it was walking with him every step. It was later discovered that there is a legend there about the devil himself haunting the woods of the mountains there. Part 3. There will also be a couple stories included from my oldest uncle, 86, and aunt, who's 80, both from my mother's side of the family, as well as also a short encounter from my brother. Personal experiences. Story number 1. My dad and myself went to the rural country cemetery located in the bowels of the mountains. This cemetery has been there for at least 80 to 90-ish years. The cemetery sits on a small hill with a very steep road going up, and only a very good truck with four-wheel drive or an off-roading vehicle could make the drive. It is located in between a four-way with only one home and a double-wide trailer, located down the hill. It has been empty and for sale for about a year or two and was empty during the time of our visit. It has a fence circling it and 2 pine trees sitting in the middle of it. That is where my family is buried at. My grandmother and grandfather were both buried there as well, as also my uncle, whom had the haunted cabin in the previous story, as his ashes buried there at the foot of my grandfather's vault. 3 other aunts and an uncle is also buried there as well, along with my great-grandparents. We got out and went in through the chain-locked gate that you have to pull apart and open from the outside. And we sat there at the grave of my grandparents for about 20 or 30 minutes, talking. We sometimes liked to walk around the grounds for a little bit before we headed back to town, and today was no different. We walked around looking at the graves for the 17 and 1800s, as well as Cherokee graves marked by rocks at the very back of the cemetery. However, I find something odd on the ground by the flat grave marker of a grave from the 1800s. It was a large, bare foot, at least 2 times larger than my own. I sat there stunned by what I was seeing. Its big toe was extremely large and round in the shape of a quarter, perfectly round. Its arch was very broad and curved, very sharply, making the rest of the foot almost look sideways in appearance. Whatever it was there the night prior passing through. I inspected the ground surrounding the rest of the cemetery and saw nothing else, no other tracks, nothing. When I got home, I told my mother what had happened. She seemed to believe me, and my father, considering I never had lied about or seen anything like that before, and could see the amazement on my face. Sometime later, my aunt happened to be visiting, and I told her about the track I had found out there, and what she told me was extremely creepy. She told me that when my other uncle, my father's other brother, was out there visiting the graves year prior, he had come home and said that something was in the cemetery. He said he had felt watched and was very creeped out, being alone back there. Story number 2. When my grandmother died in the fall, early winter of 2018, my aunt and uncle had moved into her trailer until they could secure a new home and move back from Tennessee to be closer to family. Many people who stayed the night there while my grandmother was still alive would swear that my grandfather's spirit, who died of cancer under hospice care in the trailer years prior, was haunting the residents. Strange footsteps in the night, voices, and knocking on the trailer walls would always be reported. My father had even encountered said oddities. The knocking would come from outside, and when looking outside or stepping out there with a gun, of course, nothing was there. Prior to my grandmother's passing, my father's only living brother had come to visit her at the trailer one evening and said that he had seen my grandfather standing by her with his arm around her and said, "Son, I'm going to see your mother very, very soon." And then vanished. And my grandmother did join him a few months later. That was when my aunt and uncle had moved in. Afterwards, nothing strange happened. Yet, and eventually they had found a suitable new home to move into. And on a cold winter's night, in the dead of night, and the power to the trailer being cut off, as you would expect, given them moving the power bill didn't need to be paid, we arrived at the home and began moving them out. Boxes of clothes, the TV, the couch, and beds, all loaded into the U-Haul parked in the front yard with the engine running and keys in the ignition. Suddenly, every light source we had helping us to see suddenly went out. The flashlight we had hung on the front porch facing the front door even went out. And the U-Haul's engine completely died. We went back out and turned them back on, however, a few minutes later. It did it again, as everything went black. That is when I started being followed around while inside the rooms of the trailer. I felt someone was following me around, and I swear at times I would hear a female voice saying, "Hi," as well as also a male spirit, which was also heard by my father while in the living room. This continued on, and finally, after everything was loaded into the U-Haul and we regrouped outside getting ready to leave, we were talking out in the front yard. I swear I could hear someone walking across the hardwood floors in the home. We left a few minutes later. A new family moved in a few months later, after doing some rehab on the trailer, and as far as we know, no other paranormal activity has since been reported. Story number 3. My father and myself were driving back to town after visiting my aunt, his sister, and my uncle has their trailer. It was a late evening and raining. Everything was muddy and wet, and fog was hovering somewhat over the hills and ridge lines. Well, we got to the bend in the round, a little curve about a mile out from their house, when suddenly this woman with short black hair comes walking out of the dense, thick woods. My father almost hit his head on and swerved to avoid her. She was wearing a rain jacket and black sweatpants and dirty tennis shoes. It looked like she had been in the woods all night, and maybe even all week long. She had mud all over her pants, her jacket and shirt underneath was soaking wet, and her hair was a mess. She looked very disheveled and stared at us all the way up the road, just staring. I even looked back in the rearview mirror, and she was still up there at the side of the road looking at us, not even moving back into the woods or walking away. She just continued to stand there, staring. She was never seen again. I often wondered just what the hell she was doing out there, wet and alone. Perhaps she was kidnapped. Perhaps she was sexually assaulted. Whatever the case, however, something was definitely off about her. Brother's perspective. Story number 1. My brother and his friend were deer hunting in some woods up in the area close to his home. This was multiple years ago, so nothing recent. They were going through the woods with their guns, when suddenly they spot something up in a tree watching them. This thing jumps from the high vantage point it's at, around 10 or 20 feet high, and falls all the way down to the ground below without being seriously injured. It was covered in thick, matted hair, and it was on 2 legs. They aimed their guns at it, but the thing screamed at them, though he considered it more like a roar and charged them. They ran out of the woods as fast as they could, as this thing chased them for quite some time, before finally losing it and getting back home in one piece. Uncle and Aunt's perspective. Story number 1. My aunt and uncle are the oldest of my mother's family. My uncle had served in the Vietnam War and was even at one point during his stay overseas, had even been captured along with his brother. They were held hostage by the Viet Cong in the jungles. He would often tell stories of how they would whip them and beat them mercilessly and throw feces on them. After he returned home, they lived up in the rural area where my mother's family had grown up their whole lives before she had moved to the city and started a private in-home nursing and hospice center where my aunt had personally cared for deathly ill patients ranging from dementia to cancer. She treated them all with respect and kindness. However, around the early 2010s, after she had long since retired and my uncle started to become ill, as well as the organization who helped get them the house in the first place, had foreclosed on them, and they were forced to move into a retirement home by the interstate. It was a high-rise apartment building located by the interstate. Mostly only elderly and handicapped people were living there. Well, around a few months to maybe a year into their stay there, one night they saw an elderly woman who had Alzheimer's walking across a frozen pond near the building. No one even knew she was even gone. They watched in horror as the woman fell through the ice and drowned in the lake. No one discovered her body until the next morning. After that, however, some say her spirit lingered in the building. My aunt and uncle would often talk about how they would hear footsteps. And one night, my uncle had gotten up for something to drink in the middle of the night, to see the woman standing there in the middle of the living room. Frightened, he flicked on the light and she vanished. This continued for months and weeks as the spirit of the woman haunted their living area. Even though they were forced to move again after my uncle had dementia for years prior, it started to progress even more during this time, and just last year, he would lose his long battle with the evil disease. That is it for my story, but I would just like to say, for those searching for really creepy backwoods paranormal activity, one should stay far away from eastern Kentucky. So, this is a story my dad recently told me about my grandpa, his dad, and my great-grandpa. My grandpa grew up in very rural southern Indiana, but moved to very rural southern Illinois in his youth, so this takes place in Illinois. One night, Grandpa and his dad were hanging out at his uncle's, who lived a couple of miles away. Keep in mind, this is the 40s out in the country, so all roads are just dirt basically. Anyway, it was pretty late, so they decided to head home and hopped into their old car, going probably about 15 miles per hour through these roads in the woods. At some point, as they're just driving and talking, they passed something along the edge of the road, standing upright. They both hunted and were very familiar with any animals or local people that may be around. Neither of them really said anything for a minute, and then they both looked at each other and said, "What the hell was that?" My grandpa asked his dad, "Do you want to turn around?" And he said, "Nope." And they kept driving. My grandpa said it resembled a big owl or small person just standing in the ditch. Rumor has it, it could have been a sort of Bigfoot or the legendary Mothman. I grew up on Long Island in New York State. My older sister, her boyfriend, and myself often would walk the trails and the beaches at night. On one particular evening, the three of us were on a walk at Camp Hero State Park. It was a full moon, so it was very bright out. As we were walking the trail, we stopped to relax and look out over the water. My sister's boyfriend sparked up a joint, and we were all partaking and relaxing. Whilst we were gazing out onto the open water, we spotted a small light in the distance. My sister inquired as to what we thought that was. Her boyfriend said it was probably a light on in a distant boat. I agreed, and we didn't think much of it. However, as moments passed, we noticed the light seemed to be approaching us, getting closer by the minute. As it moved closer, it appeared to not be on the water, but above the water in the sky. We soon realized it was not a light on a distant boat. We continued to speculate what it was, and I came to the conclusion that it must be someone's small personal drone. But as the light came closer and closer, the brightness got stronger and stronger. If you know Camp Hero, you know that there are cliff edges that hang over the water. There we are, standing there on the edge with this orb steadily approaching us. Within the span of 5 minutes, the orb was no longer in the distance, but hanging right in front of us. It was no longer over the water, but rather over the sandy beach. We stood there staring at it. It had a whitish purple glow to it. Despite being night, it was bright out due to the light of the full moon. On this high visibility evening, it became evident this was no drone. This light was standalone. No machinery of any kind attached to it, and it just hung there about 10 feet in front of us for about 30 seconds. It then just disappeared in such a way that it almost seemed to envelop itself. We all decided to get the hell out of there, and that was that. This was back in 2015-ish. I've since visited this particular park many times, and have never seen anything like it again. Maybe we were all just a bunch of stoned teenagers, and it was some sort of group delusion. But that night will stick with me forever. The park itself is shrouded in mystery, and I can only speculate that the orb was perhaps a remnant of one of the experiments conducted at Camp Hero from back in the day. Anyway, that's my story. Have any of you had any spooky experiences on Long Island? I apologize that this is not exactly backwoods, but the park is wooded, and strange things happen around these parts all the time. So I wanted to recount a bizarre series of events from my childhood. When I was a kid, I lived in Clinton, Tennessee. Both parents worked full-time, so I was often sent over to stay with my grandparents, who had a plot of land in the vicinity of, but not right in, Mossheim, near Greenville. Both of them had been in East Tennessee for their whole lives, in that area for a good many years. They had been established at their home for some decades before this story, and remained there a good time after. Recently, I had reason to return to that area in Tennessee after having spent the majority of my adult life in Minnesota. Being in and around the area, driving the same roads, made me reminiscent about my lazy summer days tucked away at my grandparents', learning to shoot on the same .22 with which Grandpa had taught Mom, feeding fish at a neighbor's stocked pond, or spotting deer and bear with binoculars from the back porch. When I relayed this to my mom, she in turn told me a story about a time I scared my grandpa half to death, then lied about hanging out with Bigfoot. At first, I had no idea what she was on about. Then I remembered exactly what actually happened, with startling clarity. New context given by the experience adulthood provides. And no, this is not about Bigfoot or a cryptid. Before we start, some information about my grandparents' land. Their house was on a small hill surrounded by a grass lawn. the lawn gave way to a smallish hayfield, then the wood line. Those woods lasted for a good half-mile to either side of the home, and a good several miles to the back. I hated the hayfield because it was always too pokey to play in, but liked to hang out in a creek that ran behind it. To get there, I would walk to the edge of the property, just in the woodline to avoid the hay. While at my grandparents', the only rules were that I stay where I could see the house, so the house could see me. I was to take a whistle with me anywhere I went. This time, I didn't take the whistle, seeing it as a badge of my regrettably young age. And the best part of the creek was out of sight of the house. That was the only stretch where it got deeper than my knees, and thus the only part where I could swim. Naturally, I spent much of my time in that water splashing around, skipping stones and being a kid. One day, I was playing in the creek when I noticed someone. It was a man, a stranger, on the bank, watching me. He had long hair, a beard, and pale skin so dirty it was stained. I could not tell his age and simply thought of him as old. I have no better guess now, as he clearly went through long years of hard living. He wore no shirt, no pants, only a wrap of dirty cloth around his waist that I thought of as a Moses dress, thanks to some illustrated Bible stories. Around his neck, there were multiple necklaces made from knotted tatters of cloth, fiber, and string. In those knots were various pieces of detritus, mostly bones, but some flowers and bits of dark glass. When I first saw him there by the creek, I was terrified. Frozen still. The man, however, was smiling. He gestured from his squat, with an outstretched arm, fingers down, in a kind of "don't stop for me" wave. I didn't react, startled and reeling. Then he splashed at me, still smiling. He did it again. I splashed back, and soon we were playing. We both threw water at each other. He jumped into the creek and stomped around with me, laughing all the while. He threw rocks into the water, and so did I. I pushed him, he pushed me back. We carried on for some minutes until my grandma called for me. With her voice, a switch had turned off. The man stopped in his tracks, gaze fixed back toward the house. Then, as my grandma kept on hollering, he looked at me. He crept back to his side of the creek, barely disturbing the water, then slid into the bush, completely silent the whole way, holding my gaze. Once he was out of sight, I waded in the water until my grandma found me. She wanted to know if I was alone. I said no. She became very tense, asking who was with me while looking around. I didn't answer. I didn't know how. Seeing no one, she pulled me back to the house without any more words, gripped like iron the whole time. At the house, the real inquisition began. I didn't really have new words, the event and this reaction overwhelming my ability to explain. Such silence further irked my grandma, and I was swiftly placed in a corner, held without bail, awaiting patriarchal judgment. Around an hour later, my grandpa came home from work. He was told about my churlishness and was ready to set into me again when I started talking. I told him about the man, hairy and old, dressed like Moses, about how we played, then he disappeared. I remember they digested this for a few minutes before sending me to my room. I was happy to go, and happier still Grandpa did not yell like he usually did when misbehaved. Later, I was brought out for dinner. I ate in the kitchen with Grandma, but Grandpa called me to the back porch. He was on the swinging bench, looking out over the hayfield turned red by the setting sun. He had kicked off his boots and put them next to a shotgun. I knew that was odd for the gun to be out of the closet. Previously, we had used it to shoot bottles. Some I would throw them into the air like they were clay pigeons. These escapades were accompanied with speeches about how the gun was dangerous and only for adults to use. He went through my story again, his tone deadly serious. Eventually, he asked me how hairy was the man, really. I told him very, thinking this was the right answer. He asked me where. I told him everywhere like a bear. He ruminated on this, and I grew more nervous, worried I was in trouble or causing trouble, just wanting the trouble, whatever it lied to end. So, when he finally asked me to swear in the name of Christ and on my mother that I was telling the truth about everything, I said I had been joking. He finally yelled then and sent me back to my room. The family memory became that I had hid by the creek and made up a tale about Bigfoot. At the time, everyone was very upset with me, and I was forbidden from going back to the creek or anywhere out of sight. The enforcement of this rule, like the others, was lackluster. Even so, for a time I didn't go to the creek. In my memory, I stayed away for a very long time, but I am sure it was only a few days. That hiatus feeling interminable in my elementary-aged self. When I did start going to the creek, I took a bucket of toys, mostly Godzilla, and a thick stick plucked from the woodline on the way. I think I was conflicted about what to do if the man came back, imagining either impressing him with my toy collection or clubbing him, or both in turn. When he did show back up, he appeared next to me as I dozed under a tree on my side of the creek. I was once again gripped with terror. He was not smiling, his face expressionless as he lurked beside me, having watched for who knows how long before I smelled him. I scrambled away, leaving behind my stick and toys. Coming to my feet a yard out, I stood in the sun while the man watched me from the shade. Eventually, he crouched and started to look through my bucket. I remember becoming indignant as he examined my toys one by one, only to toss them into the dirt. It became too much, and I started to lecture the man, telling him about how he got me in trouble, how he was a weirdo, how he stank. At some point, he stopped looking through my things and calmly watched my tirade. His face was neutral, eyes analytic. Once I had concluded my lecture, I sat back under the tree to pout, having become hot in the sun. I remember the man made a noise, a grinding kind of snort, and when I looked over at him, he was chuckling while he inspected the last few figures in my bucket. I wanted to laugh too, but was more determined to stay sullen. Once everything was out of the bucket, he put one figure, Ghidorah, back in the bucket. He then stood to his hunched fullest, took the bucket by its handle, began to make his way back into the woods. I stayed by the tree until he turned, said something, not a word I knew or know, and gestured with a forward sweep of his hand. At first I didn't comply, despite knowing he wanted me to follow. After a few moments, he yipped, clicked his teeth, and gestured again more empathetically. With this further prompt, I did get up and come along, the man making approving noises and putting on his smile again. We went into the woods. The man led, but he was naturally quicker and quieter, making it hard to keep up. Eventually, he would stop when he lost me, knocking on trees with sticks and whistling so that I may find him in the vegetation. He never came back for me, opting instead to guide me forward with the noises. I became lost, having only a vague sense of my grandparents' place being behind me. After some time, maybe 15 minutes, we came to a bald. The man had me wait there, indicated by patting the ground, before going into the tree line alone. He returned from a different direction pulling a sled. It was made from half of a discarded plastic drum and lined with small pelts and smooth bark. On the back half, there rested the fly-covered carcasses of squirrels, possums, and other critters savaged into anonymity. On the pulling end, woven pouches were tied into place on it by the same eclectic cordage that made the man's necklaces. He put my bucket on the sled and tossed Ghidorah in a pouch. He then called me closer with a glottal noise and beckoning wave. I saw the sled's pouches held many odds and ends: dried salamanders, mushrooms, metal bits, glass fragments. From one, the man pulled a square made from bound together sticks, just big enough to slip over my wrist. From another, he pulled a piece of fool's gold and a small shard of geode crusted with a bit of purple crystal. Then, he handed to me with an air of business and a few more utterings of nonsense. He then patted the group for me to sit down. I did so without much bewilderment, understanding we had traded the same as exchanging Pokemon cards at recess. I did not much miss Ghidorah anyway, as he was a bad guy. The bucket was a loss. In retrospect, I think Ghidorah was chosen because its dull gold scales resembled something valuable. The bucket for its obvious ability to hold things. The man came back and gestured for me to follow by slapping his thigh. I did this readily. During the hike back, I tried to keep up and pay attention. I did so moderately well, having to be whistled over a few times. I did notice that our path was not straight. The man led me one way and then another, making turns unneeded by the lay of the land. We eventually came out by the creek, but from a different approach than where we had left. I could hear my grandma calling for me again, not from up on the hill, but from out in the field. The man would not cross the creek, but pushed me to do so. I did, but did not go to my grandma. Instead, I crept back to the house and around to the opposite side. There I laid in the shrubs by our front door pretending to sleep, when I was found. I swore I had been there the whole time. When I was sent back to my room, I placed my fool's gold, crystal, and charm in my bedside table for safekeeping. The next day, I went back to the creek to pick up my toys. The man was not there. However, throughout that summer, he did visit me again to sit under the tree and throw rocks at the water or yammer softly to himself. I would bring snacks and candy to share, and he would likewise give me stringy dried meat, which I ought not to have ate, or honeysuckle blossoms, which I still would eat, taken from my old bucket. He seldom visited long, and never splashed and whooped like he did on that first meeting. At this point, you may be wondering why I have written to the Backwoods creepy and not to Backwoods weird but wholesome, I guess. Well, there are two more occasions I want to account, one gruesome and one awful. The eventful one occurred near the 4th of July. I had brought 2 boxes of bang snaps to the creek. The man was initially wary of the little fireworks, but quickly came to appreciate their miniature pyrotechnics. He took the box I gave him gratefully, even taking the empty box, likely for the wood shavings, which are excellent tinder. During the use of the bang snaps, I had scared a turtle into the water and to the opposite bank. It sat there watching us from the far shore. The man, after stowing the bang snaps in the bucket, noticed the turtle. With little thought, he scooped up a smooth stone and threw it with force and accuracy into the turtle. He then waded over to retrieve the slider, which struggled meekly in his grasp, one leg knocked clean off. On my side of the river, he took from the bucket a new piece of stone. One side was rounded and fit in his hand. The other came to a flinty cutting edge. Working with deft experience, the man began chopping the live turtle above its neck, pulling up on the shell top. The thing struggled and bled as it was dissected. The dome eventually coming free, the turtle dropped to mingle its viscera with dirt and sand. The man rinsed the shell in the river, then offered it to me. In wordless horror, I ran. That evening, I came back to shuffle the dead turtle into the flowing waters of the creek. The shell itself was nowhere to be found. This experience did not deter me from going to the creek or the man from visiting again. However, sometimes he would try to call me away from the creek with thumps and whistles. I would tell him I heard him and refused to move. On some occasions, he would join me. On others, he would leave. The last time we met, we were sitting under the trees sharing cowtails. From the woods, there came whistling and the staccato knocking of a woodpecker. The man looked up and whistled back. There were a few more such exchanges before he stood, collected his bucket, and beckoned for me to follow. I was curious and felt comfortable with the man as a guide, so I did as asked. He took me back to the bald, a direct path this time, periodically stopping to call or respond to the other in the wood. Waiting for us at the bald was a woman and a child. The woman was dressed the same as the man, topless, wrapped at the waist. She was dirty, with long hair and a wiry frame. The child was in a similar state, wearing a sack that went to their knees. The man sat on the ground and the woman joined him, sitting in his lap but leaning forward so that her elbows rested on her crossed knees. She had dark brown eyes that were fixated on me. The other child would not look up. I didn't know what to do and didn't speak. The other kid lifted their sack to wipe at their nose, and I learned under all that dirt, they were a her. The man made a noise and drummed on the woman's bare back. The kid looked at them, still hanging her head, hair covering her face. The woman yammered and swatted at the girl lazily, the man echoing her noises, slapping skin to skin once more. At this bizarre scene, the girl stumbled toward me, stopping close enough I could smell her and hear her wheezing breath. She was thin but not emaciated, and slightly taller than me, should she have straightened up. The man and woman fussed some more. Then the girl leaned close and pressed her cheek to mine. Her hair was in between us, greasy and cold. She made no move to embrace me, no move at all, only pressing limply against me and breathing so loud it was all I could hear. During this time, the woman had approached. She pulled the girl back by her shoulder with one hand and delivered a flurry of slaps to the crown of the girl's head. The woman then gathered the girl's hair in one hand, using the other to sweep back her bangs. The girl was then made to look at me, face bare. One side of her jaw was bulged out, smooth skin over a lemon-shaped bump. Her mouth was twisted by this deformity. Her nose faced to one side as if affixed sideways and leaked a trail of clear snot. One eye was bulged and roomy. The other, startlingly regular. It looked at me, blank and dark brown. The woman gave the girl's head a little shake, spat off to the side, then cooed like a dove as she smiled at me. I fled. There was commotion behind me. I think the girl was pushed to the ground. I did not look back, and they did not pursue. My flight ended at my grandparents' house, my absence unnoticed. I chose not to tell anyone what happened, wanting to forget, not wanting to get in trouble, not thinking about the girl, the couple, what was intended for me. I spent that August inside whenever I visited my grandparents. I begged not to be taken, claiming it was boring and lonely. Sometimes, when I sat on the porch or went from the car to the house, I catch a snippet of bird call on the wind, on the distant tapping of wood, and hurry inside. My grandma could tell something was wrong and made an effort to entertain me in town. My grandpa cared in his own way, involving me in his errands as he never had before. Eventually school started. Classes and friends eased me away from thoughts of the dirty man or the people in the clearing. Time did the rest. I think now that all of the people in the clearing were of a family, but their features, white skin, brown eyes, brown hair, are common enough that they all could have been unrelated. I'm sure they lived together. They knew each other's signs and signals. They used their own words. I know that the Smokies are full of tales of feral people, wild men, and superstition. I also know that they are full of people living in unlikely ways in unlikely places, and that those real people call others kin. And that through the chain of human connection, even a recluse living in a rundown shack is someone's somebody. I guess I am asking if the people in my story are somebody's someone, or if they are known, or if their behavior rings any bells, belies any known intention. I figured here, where the tale would not be discounted out of hand, might be the place to ask. So, who do you all think that family was? They didn't really creep me out, but still to this day, I'm wondering if they were dangerous or meant no harm. Years ago, I moved from a very small town to a remote valley out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by national forest and not many neighbors. It was just what I had always wanted. At that point in my life, I had been a paramedic for about 4 or 5 years, and being an outdoorsy, civic-minded sort, I decided to volunteer my services with a local search and rescue organization. For being such a tiny, poorly funded organization, we were surprisingly busy. In the 9 years I was with them, we'd have at least one rescue, sometimes several, every weekend, spring through fall. The source of the majority of these calls was the roughly 100 miles of poorly maintained fire trails that were very popular with dirt bike and quad riders. When they'd inevitably get lost or wreck and get injured, we'd head out, track them down, provide medical care, and fly them out on a helicopter, or put them on a Stokes basket mounted to a janky-ass trailer thing we'd pull with a quad. About 2 weeks after joining, and with zero training beyond what I had learned as a Boy Scout and medic, I got my first call. A group of dirt bikers from the city had lost a member of their party. For some reason, they had put their least experienced rider at the back of the group of a dozen or so riders and took off into the woods. When they returned to the trailhead 4 hours later, the inexperienced guy was missing. They set out again and looked for him for 4 or 5 hours, then gave up and called 911. The time interval from the initial 911 call until we had a squad assembled at the trailhead was pretty impressive. No more than 20 minutes. But we were already 8 or 9 hours behind the ball. We did a very quick briefing, distributed maps, divided into teams, then set off. They put me on a quad with the most experienced guy and we headed out. The plan was for each 2 to 3 person team to take one of the longer trails that ringed the place. Then, after searching those, we'd systematically work our way into the shorter, maze-like trails that made up the interior. This was to be a hasty search, none of that grid search crap, just riding around looking for clues. I don't know what I had expected exactly. Maybe a few dirt roads through the woods or something. But these trails were an absolute nightmare. They were extremely rugged, technical trails, where you really had to know what the hell you were doing and where you were going or you'd never make it out. GPS rarely worked due to the rugged terrain and tree cover. Radios and cell phones were a crapshoot, and the maps didn't account for all the random trails riders would just sort of make. The only marked roads were fire breaks, and mileage-wise, those accounted for maybe 10% of the trails. Why this guy hadn't been partnered with someone or put at the front of the group is still a mystery. 4 hours into this, I'm caked with mud, bleeding from being hit with branches, exhausted, and just freaking done. We take a water break and hear broken radio traffic that sounds like the bike had been found, but no rider. It's only a couple of miles from us, so we head that direction. When we get there, the bike is off to the side of the road, along with the quads of the other teams, but we can see them a few hundred feet into the woods. We walk over and find them looking down at the missing person, who, by the way, is very dead. Lips blue, skin dusky, arms spread out like a cross. On first glance, his eyes look to be wide open and solid white, but when I examined him, I could see that his eyes were actually covered with fly eggs. This dude had been dead a while. It didn't make any sense though. His bike still had gas in it. He had water and food, and he was a healthy guy in his late 20s. Why was he dead? It looked like he had simply laid his bike down, then ran into the woods to die. Mission accomplished, I guess. We wrapped him in blankets, then put him on the stokes and took him to the trailhead, where the coroner was waiting. About a week later, I ran into the coroner and asked what the cause of death had been. The pathologist's determination was cardiac dysthymia secondary to extreme anxiety. The guy literally died of fright, which up to that point I had always assumed was Hollywood bullcrap. I've always wondered what was going through his head. Was he just afraid of the woods or of being lost? If so, why did he run blindly into the woods instead of continuing to follow the trail? There's a part of me that thinks he may have seen something out there. I've heard a lot of stories about weird shit in these woods, and I've seen a few strange things myself, so it wouldn't surprise me if he actually did encounter something that still remains a mystery. And that, dear listeners, is the end of these true creepy backwoods stories. If you are sleeping, I hope Slumberland is treating you kindly. If you are simply listening during the day or afternoon, I hope you have enjoyed this collection. Until next time, I'll read to you soon. Have yourself a good morning, a good afternoon, or a good night.